My name is Thomas Morrison, and I have been mopping the floors of West Haven Academy for 11 years, and I want to tell you about the smell of the corridors at 6:45 in the morning before the students arrive. Because the smell is important, and because the smell is the first thing I noticed on the morning that changed everything. The corridors of West Haven Academy smell like old money and new paint, and the specific combination of floor wax and fresh flowers that the administration orders every Monday from a florist in the city whose annual contract costs more than my salary. And I know this because I have seen the invoices, and I know the invoices because for 11 years, I have been the man who is present in every room before anyone considers the room worth occupying, and the man who is present in every room. After everyone has decided the room no longer requires their attention. And what I have learned in 11 years of being that man is that invisible people see everything. I want to tell you about the Tuesday in October when Ashley Hartwell walked past my daughter in the main corridor and said loud enough for the corridor to hear it. "There goes the trash duo," and then laughed the specific laugh of a 17-year-old girl who has never once in her life considered that the people around her might have an interior world worth considering. And I was at the end of the corridor with the mop and the bucket and the specific posture of a man who has learned to make his body take up as little space as possible in rooms that were not designed to include him. And I watched Claire's face receive the words, and I watched her do what she had learned to do over 4 years at West Haven, which was to keep walking and keep her face arranged in the expression that showed nothing. Because showing something required an audience that cared, and West Haven Academy had made it very clear over 4 years that Claire Morrison was not the kind of student whose feelings constituted a relevant data point. They did not know that the documents in my locker at the end of that corridor were worth more than the entire West Haven estate, and everything built on it. I need to tell you about West Haven Academy before I tell you about the gala, because you cannot understand what happened at the gala without understanding what West Haven was and what it had decided certain people were worth. The academy sat on 14 acres in the most expensive postal district in the county, and it had been educating the children of the wealthy and the connected and the specifically ambitious for 93 years. And in those 93 years, it had developed the specific institutional confidence of a place that has never had to question its own value, because its value has always been confirmed by the quality of the families who paid to attend it. The fees were $42,000 per year, and the waiting list was 3 years long. And the buildings were the kind that architectural journalists described as characterful, and that parents described as exactly right, and that I described to myself on Monday mornings as the place where I worked, and where my daughter was learning that the world was divided into people whose names were on the donor boards in the entrance hall, and people whose names were on the cleaning roster in the maintenance office. Claire had won a scholarship. I want to be precise about this because the scholarship matters, and because Claire winning it matters, and because the way West Haven treated a scholarship student in the years following her arrival tells you everything you need to know about the specific texture of the class divide that operated inside those characterful buildings. Claire had the highest entrance examination score in the history of the scholarship program, a fact that the admissions director had mentioned to me in a phone call that lasted 4 minutes and that Claire had never been told, because West Haven did not consider it useful for scholarship students to know how exceptional they were, since exceptional scholarship students developed expectations. And expectations in students whose parents were not on the donor board created a particular kind of institutional inconvenience. They did not know that I had been the anonymous donor behind the Morrison Foundation for 11 years, and that the Morrison Foundation had given more to West Haven Academy than the Hartwell family had given in 3 generations. of attendance. Richard Hartwell was on the Board of Governors, and Richard Hartwell had donated the new sports wing. And Richard Hartwell arrived at board meetings in a car that cost more than most people's houses and conducted himself in every institutional space with the authority of a man who has learned that money donated to the right places produces a specific kind of deference that is more satisfying than anything money can directly purchase. Ashley was Richard Hartwell's daughter, and Ashley had grown up understanding that West Haven Academy was in some meaningful sense hers. The way that children of significant donors understand that institutions reflect their families back to them as confirmation of their importance. And Ashley had extended this understanding to the social architecture of the school in a way that was precise and consistent, and that had made Claire Morrison's 4 years at West Haven a particular kind of education that had nothing to do with the curriculum. I watched Claire from the end of corridors. I watched her eat lunch at the table near the fire exit, because the tables in the center of the dining room had an occupancy logic that was never written down, and never needed to be written down, because everyone understood it, and Claire understood it, and I understood it. And I mopped the floor around the fire exit table, and I said nothing. And I kept my face in the expression I had developed over 11 years, which was the expression of a man who is doing his job and has no other function in the room. They did not know that the Hartwell family mortgage had been purchased by a property holding company whose sole director was the man mopping the floor around the fire exit table. I kept a black leather diary in the same locker as the documents. The diary had dates in it, and the dates were specific, and the most important date was the date of the annual West Haven Gala, which was 6 weeks from the Tuesday in October, when Ashley Hartwell said "trash duo" in the main corridor, loud enough for the corridor to hear it. The gala was where the school thanked its donors, and where Richard Hartwell sat at the front table, and where the headmistress made speeches about the families who had built West Haven into what it was, and where Claire Morrison, if she attended at all, would sit near the back in the position that the school had assigned her for 4 years. I closed the locker. I picked up the mop. I looked at the corridor that smelled like old money and new paint, and I thought about the gala, and I thought about the documents, and I thought about what a room full of people looks like when it finally understands who has been building the thing. It thought it owned, and I went back to work. The morning after Ashley Hartwell said "trash duo" in the main corridor of West Haven Academy, I arrived at 6:42, and I began with the entrance hall. The way I always began with the entrance hall, because the entrance hall was the first thing the students saw when they arrived, and the administration had a specific standard for the entrance hall that I had met every morning for 11 years without being thanked for meeting it. And I was on my 3rd pass with the floor buffer when the Hartwell car arrived, and I want to tell you about the Hartwell car. Because the Hartwell car is a detail that contains a larger truth about the specific way that certain families understand their relationship to the spaces. They moved through the car was black and long, and moved through the academy gates with the unhurried confidence of a vehicle that has never once, in its existence, been required to wait for anything. And it stopped at the entrance with the precision of a car whose driver has been trained to stop at entrances in a way that communicates the importance of the person being delivered. And Richard Hartwell did not get out. He never got out in the mornings. The door opened, and Ashley emerged with the specific energy of a girl who has woken up in a world arranged entirely for her comfort, and she walked through the entrance of West Haven Academy without looking at the doors or at the floor. I had buffed to its current standard, or at the man holding the buffer, who had watched her arrive, and who had been watching her arrive for 4 years from the specific vantage point of someone the room has decided does not require acknowledgement. And the car moved away, and I went back to the buffer, and I thought about the document in my locker. And I thought about Richard Hartwell's name on the mortgage that Aegis Holdings had acquired 7 months ago. And I thought about the specific quality of a Tuesday morning, when you know something the rest of the room does not know, and you have decided exactly when you are going to let the room find out. They did not know that I had spent 21 years as a structural engineer before I came to West Haven, and that the buildings I had designed were still standing in 4 cities, and that I had left that career not because I failed at it, but because my wife, Sarah, had gotten sick in the way that requires a person nearby at all hours, and the nearby person had been me. And when Sarah passed, I had Claire, who was 7, and a grief that did not leave room for the kind of work that structural engineering required, which is complete attention. And I had found West Haven, because West Haven needed someone who understood buildings. And I understood buildings better than anyone they had considered for the position. And because West Haven had a school, and the school had a scholarship program. And Claire was the kind of child who deserved the school, even if the school had not yet learned to deserve. Her Claire studied in the boiler room. I want to be precise about this because it is the detail I return to most often when I think about the 4 years at West Haven and what they cost. My daughter. The boiler room was not a study space. It was a maintenance area adjacent to the lower corridor that had a table and 2 chairs, because I had put a table and 2 chairs there in Claire's first year, when it became clear that the library study spaces were occupied in a specific way that left no room for a scholarship student whose blazer was from the previous year's uniform sale, and that the common room had a social architecture as rigid and as clearly understood as the dining room table logic, and that Claire needed somewhere to put her books and her considerable mind and work without the daily experience of being reminded by the room's arrangement that she was not the kind of student the room was designed for. So I put a table and 2 chairs in the boiler room, and Claire sat there between lessons and after school, and she worked with the focused intensity of a girl who understood that her way out of West Haven's social architecture was academic performance, and that academic performance required a place to sit and think without being told by the room what she was worth. The Hartwells. Think they own this town, but they do not even own their own living room anymore. I met Mr. Sterling on a Wednesday at a diner called Patty's on the east side of the city, 12 blocks from West Haven. And I chose Patty's because Patty's was the kind of place where a man in a blue maintenance jumpsuit eating a bowl of soup was not a detail that required explanation. And because Mr. Sterling had the specific quality of a lawyer who understood that the value of a meeting is sometimes in its location. And Patty's communicated nothing to anyone who might be watching, which was exactly the communication I required. Elliot Sterling was 64 years old, and he had spent 30 years in commercial property, law and debt acquisition, and he had the unhurried precision of a man who has handled enough significant matters to understand that significance does not require performance. He put his briefcase on the seat beside him, and he took out a folder, and he placed the folder on the table between us, and he said, "Thomas, the default notice is ready." And I looked at the folder and I said, "When?" And he said, "We can file within 72 hours of your instruction." And I said, "Not yet." And he said, "The gala." And I said, "The gala." And Elliot Sterling looked at me across the table in Patty's diner, with the expression of a man who has seen many approaches to many situations, and who has decided that this particular approach is one of the more precisely constructed ones he has encountered. And he said, "It will be a significant room." And I said, "Yes, it will." And he said, "Are you certain about the timing?" And I looked at the soup in front of me, and I thought about Ashley Hartwell saying, "Trash duo" in the main corridor. And I thought about Claire's face receiving the words. And I thought about the boiler room table, and I said, "Yes, Mr. Sterling. I am certain I want to tell you something about wearing a blue jumpsuit. When you know what I know. Because I think it is the detail that people find most difficult to understand. From the outside, the jumpsuit is a category, and the category communicates a set of assumptions about the person inside it. And those assumptions are so consistent and so completely held by the people who observe them that the person inside the jumpsuit becomes a function, rather than an individual becomes the cleaning. Rather than the cleaner becomes the maintenance, rather than the man. And I have moved through West Haven Academy for 11 years in that category. And I have heard conversations that were not moderated from my presence, because my presence was not registered as the presence of someone who processes and retains information. And I've learned things in that jumpsuit that people in more visible categories would have been very careful not to let me learn. And I have filed those things in the same place I file everything which is precisely and permanently and with the complete understanding that information retained is information available, and available information deployed at the correct moment is the most precise instrument I have ever worked with. More precise than any structural calculation. And I designed buildings that are still standing in 4 cities. The document arrived at 3:47 on a Thursday afternoon. A sealed envelope delivered to the West Haven Maintenance Office, addressed to T. Morrison, Facilities Manager. And I signed for it, and I put it in the pocket of the blue jumpsuit, and I finished the afternoon round, which included the entrance hall, the main corridor, the dining room, and the lower passage outside the boiler room, where I could see through the small window that Claire was at the table with her books and her considerable mind, working in the specific, focused way of someone who has decided that the room's opinion of her is not data. She is required to incorporate, and I finished the round, and I went to my locker, and I opened the envelope, and I read the document inside, which was the notice of default for the Hartwell estate, a property valued at $3.4 million, whose mortgage had been acquired by Aegis Holdings 8 months ago, and whose payments had been in arrears for 4 months, in a way that the Hartwell family had been managing through conversations with the previous lender that were no longer available to them, because the previous lender was no longer the relevant party. And I folded the document carefully along its original creases, and I placed it in the black leather diary between the page for the gala date and the page that contained Elliot Sterling's direct number. And I put the diary in the cleaning cart under the shelf that held the floor wax and the spare mop heads. And I pushed the cart back to the maintenance room, and I hung up the blue jumpsuit, and I put on my coat, and I walked through the entrance hall that smelled like old money and new paint, and I went to collect my daughter from the boiler room, and we drove home through the city, in the specific silence of 2 people who are each carrying something the other one almost, but not quite knows about. The ventilation duct that served the second-floor administration suite was 18 inches wide, and smelled like 11 years of filtered institutional air and the specific chemical residue of the cleaning products I used on the exterior vents during quarterly maintenance. And I was lying on my side with my toolkit beside me and my shoulder against the cold metal wall and through the return air grill. 4 feet ahead, I could see the diffused light of the administration conference room, and hear with complete clarity the conversation the headmistress and the bursar were having about the absence of the Morrison Foundation's quarterly payment, and the conversation had the texture of 2 professionals managing their own fear while trying not to amplify each other's. The headmistress said, "The payment is 9 days late, and in 11 years it has never been 1 day late." And the bursar said, "I have called the contact number 3 times, and it goes to a voicemail that says Sterling and Associates is currently unavailable." And the headmistress said, "What is our exposure? if the foundation has withdrawn and the bursar went quiet. In the specific way, people go quiet when the number they are about to say is the number that makes a situation real. And then he said the scholarship program alone costs $420,000 annually. And the library maintenance contract is another 90, and the expansion debt service requires $310,000 quarterly. And the headmistress said, "And our reserves?" And the bursar said, "3 months of operational expenditure at current levels." And the headmistress said, "So we have 1 term," and the bursar said, "Approximately." And the headmistress said, "Find out who runs that foundation and find out today." And I finished my inspection and replaced the vent cover and gathered my toolkit and reversed through the duct toward the access point. And I thought about the gala, which was in 31 hours, and I thought about the registered documentation the Charity Commission would send, which would show the Morrison Foundation's beneficial owner as Thomas Morrison of West Haven Academy Facilities Management. And I moved through the cold metal toward the light. The gymnasium was lit with full overhead lighting that made the space bright and flat and institutional, and the Student of the Year announcement was the final item in the rehearsal. And Ashley Hartwell received the news of her selection with the performance of someone who has known the outcome and has prepared the reaction. And the reaction was the warm, surprised delight of a person who wants the room to believe the result was not anticipated. And the room gave Ashley what it always gave Ashley, which was its complete attention, and Ashley's laugh in the gymnasium had the carrying quality of a sound made by someone who has never considered whether her sounds were welcome, and the laugh went to the ceiling and came back and filled the space as if the space had been designed to hold exactly that sound, and Claire sat in the 3rd row with her hands in her lap and her face in the expression she had developed over 4 years of being told by this institution in ways large and small that she was not the kind of student the room was designed to celebrate, and the gymnasium returned her silence with the same impartial efficiency. It returned Ashley's laugh. And I stood at the gymnasium door with my cart. And I noted that Claire's examination performance, which the admissions file described as exceptional in 23 years of the scholarship program, was not a category. The Student of the Year process at West Haven had been designed to weigh against family contribution, and I pushed the cart back into the corridor. Richard Hartwell came around the corner at 11:43, and he stopped when he saw me, and he said, "Morrison," in the tone that contained his complete assessment of what I was, and he said, "There is a smell in this corridor that has been present for 2 weeks." And I said, "Yes, Mr. Hartwell." And he said, "2 weeks is not a standard. I expect at an institution of this caliber." And I looked at Richard Hartwell, and I listened to him describe the smell and its duration and the specific way it had affected his experience of walking through this section of the building. And while I listened, I thought about the notice of default in the cleaning cart behind me and the $3.4 million property it referred to, and the 4 months of arrears that had accumulated while Richard Hartwell was arriving in the black car and stopping men in corridors to explain the effect of drainage odors on his sensory experience. And he said, "I expect this resolved before the gala tomorrow, Morrison." Not the day after tomorrow, and I said, "It will be resolved, Mr. Hartwell," and he said, "Today," and I said, "Yes, Mr. Hartwell," and he looked at me for the moment that people of his category give to people of mine, which is the moment required to confirm the instruction has landed in the correct type of person, and then he walked toward the administration suite, and I resolved the smell in 40 minutes and put the notice of default back in the black leather diary under the floor wax and went to collect Claire. The kitchen table at home held the black leather diary between us, and Claire read the Aegis Holdings summary and the Morrison Foundation records and the Hartwell mortgage documentation in the complete silence of someone receiving information that recontextualizes 4 years of accumulated experience. And when she looked up, she said, "How long?" And I said, 11 years. And she said, the library, and I said, yes. And she said, my scholarship, and I said, yours was the examination score. Claire, I simply made sure the program existed to award it. And Claire looked at the table and she said, I am tired. Dad. And she said, the kind of tired that does not fix with sleep. And I looked at my daughter and I thought about the boiler room table and the third row and the Tuesday in October. And I said, Claire, and she looked at me and I said, we are not fighting anymore. And I said, we stopped fighting a long time ago. And I said, what we are doing now is collecting. And Claire looked at the diary and she said, collecting. And I said, everything they have done is documented and everything they have taken is accounted for. And tomorrow evening, the account comes due. And Claire sat with that, and something moved through her expression that I had not seen. Move freely through her expression in 4 years. And I said, are you all right? And she said, yes. And she almost smiled, and I thought that almost smile was worth every morning at 6:42. I woke at 6:42 on the morning of the gala, and I lay in the dark for 4 minutes before I got up, and I want to tell you about those 4 minutes. Because they were not empty. They were the specific fullness of a person who has arrived at the end of a very long piece of work and is taking a moment before the final action to understand completely what the work has been and what it has cost and what it is about to become. I thought about Sarah in the way I think about her when something significant is approaching, which is without editing and without the careful management of feeling that the ordinary days require. And I told her what today was, and I told her about the folder and the documents and Elliot Sterling and the gala and Claire in the dark blue dress bought with bookshop money. And I told her that the blue jumpsuit was hanging on the hook in the maintenance room at West Haven Academy, where I had left it on Friday evening, folded with the same precision I applied to everything, and that I was not going to put it on this morning. And I lay in the dark for the last of the 4 minutes. And then I got up and I went to the wardrobe. The garment bag was at the back behind the winter coats in the position of something that is not hidden but has not yet been needed. And I lifted it out and laid it on the bed and unzipped it slowly. And the suit emerged in the way that things emerge when they have been waiting correctly, which is without drama and without announcement, simply present and ready. And I want to describe the physical experience of putting on that suit, because it was not vanity and it was not performance. It was the specific bodily experience of returning to a self that the world had decided I had left permanently. The charcoal wool and silk blend had a weight that communicated through the hands before it communicated through the mirror, a substantiality that the blue jumpsuit never had. Not because the jumpsuit was lesser, but because the suit was made for a different kind of room, and I was going to a different kind of room. And when I was dressed, I stood in front of the bedroom mirror, and I looked at the man looking back, and the man looking back was Thomas Morrison, structural engineer who had designed load-bearing systems in 4 cities, and who had spent 11 years building something of a different kind with the same foundational precision. And I adjusted the lapel, and I placed the black leather diary in the inside breast pocket, where it rested against my chest with the weight of 11 years of documented truth, and I went downstairs to make coffee. Claire was already in the kitchen. She was standing at the counter in the dark blue dress. And when I walked through the door, she turned and went still in the specific way people go. Still, when something they are seeing requires a moment to reconcile with the category they had assigned it. And she looked at the suit, and she looked at my face, and she said, "Dad, you look like the photographs." And I said, "What photographs?" And she said, "The ones from the Lakeview Bridge opening the ones from before." And I had not known she had found those photographs. And I stood in the kitchen and I looked at my daughter in her simple dress, bought with her own money, and I thought about the boiler room table, and the third row of the gymnasium rehearsal, and the Tuesday corridor, and the 4 years of keeping her face in the expression that showed nothing. And I said, "Claire, you look exactly right." And she said, "Are we ready?" And I said, "Almost." And I called Elliot Sterling, and he said, "The car is outside." And I picked up the folder from the kitchen table, and Claire and I walked out of the house. The Hartwell car arrived at the West Haven Gala entrance at 7:51, and it arrived the way it always arrived, which was with the deliberate, unhurried confidence of a vehicle communicating the importance of its contents before the contents have emerged. And Richard Hartwell stepped out with the ease of a man for whom public arrival is a practiced art. And Ashley followed in the dress that had cost more than Claire's entire wardrobe. And the event photographer captured them at the entrance, with the efficiency of someone who has been told which guests require capturing. And the Hartwell entrance took 4 minutes and involved 3 separate greetings with governor families before they reached the main hall, and the whole performance had the quality of people who believe that the manner of their arrival is itself a contribution to the occasion. Elliot Sterling's car stopped at the entrance 11 minutes later, and the door opened without ceremony, and Claire stepped out, and then I stepped out onto the entrance of the West Haven annual gala in the charcoal suit. And the security member at the door looked at me and looked at Claire and looked at the suit and said, "Good evening, sir," in the tone reserved for guests of apparent significance. And he consulted the list, and I said, "Morrison." And he found the name and said, "Of course, Mr. Morrison." "Welcome," and indicated the entrance, and I walked through the doors of West Haven Academy without the cleaning cart and without the blue jumpsuit, and with the posture of a man who understands the structural load of every beam above him, because he has studied the original drawings, and 2 teachers from the mathematics department were standing near the entrance talking. And they both looked at me as I passed with the polite, attentive interest that significant guests receive at institutional events. And I had sat 3 feet from both of them in the corridor outside the staff room on a Tuesday morning. 3 weeks ago, eating a sandwich, and they had continued their conversation without registering my presence, and I noted the difference without satisfaction, and walked into the main hall. The event manager approached with the seating chart and consulted it and said, "Mr. Morrison, you and your guest are at table 24, and indicated the direction of table 24, which was positioned near the kitchen service corridor in the area of the room that the seating logic of West Haven events reserved for guests whose category had not yet been established to the satisfaction of whoever arranged the tables." And Claire looked at me with the expression of someone who recognizes the specific logic being applied. And I looked at Claire and I said, "That is fine." And we followed the event manager to table 24, and we sat down, and I placed the folder on the white tablecloth in front of me, and I looked across the room at table 1. Richard Hartwell was already at the diamond table with Ashley beside him, and with the 3 governor families who occupied that table at every West Haven gala. And Richard Hartwell was laughing at something the man beside him had said. And the laugh was the specific laugh of a man who is fully at ease in a room he believes belongs to him, and who has no information that would cause him to sit differently, or speak differently, or hold his wine glass with any less comfortable authority, and he had not looked toward table 24, and I did not require him to. Not yet. I placed my hand flat on the folder on the table in front of me. And I thought about the notice of default inside it and the $3.4 million property it referred to. And I thought about the man I had watched stop a man in a corridor 2 days ago to describe the effect of a drainage smell on his sensory experience, while 18 inches away in a cleaning cart sat the legal instrument that would end his lifestyle before this evening was finished, and I ordered water, and I waited. The headmistress took the podium at 8:47. She was wearing the formal dress she wore every year, and she had the composed, professional expression she wore for occasions, except that beneath the composed, professional expression was the worry I had identified in the ventilation duct. On Thursday morning, the unresolved anxiety of a woman managing a financial uncertainty. She cannot discuss in a room full of people whose confidence in the institution she cannot afford to disturb. And she welcomed the guests, and she thanked the donors, and she moved through the formal opening of the gala with the practiced fluency of someone who has done this many times. And then she paused, and she said, "Tonight we have something unprecedented in the 11-year history of the Morrison Foundation's support for this institution," and she said our most significant benefactor has decided for the very first time to step out of the shadows. And she said, "We would like to thank them as they deserve to be thanked in person." And the room produced the attentive murmur of people expecting to look toward the front tables. And I picked up the folder and I stood up from table 24. And I buttoned the jacket. And the room began to understand that the movement was coming from the back. And Richard Hartwell looked up from table 1 and looked at the man rising from table 24. And his face began the revision that was going to be complete and permanent. And I walked from the back of the room toward the podium, and the room watched and was silent. And I reached the podium, and I looked at the headmistress, and I said, "Good evening." And I said, "My name is Thomas Morrison." And I said, "I am the founder of the Morrison Foundation." And I said, "I am also the facilities manager at West Haven Academy." And I said, "I have been both of those things for 11 years. And I said, I believe it is time this room understood what it is actually standing on." And I opened the folder and I began, "The walk from table 24 to the podium of the West Haven Annual Gala took 41 steps, and I counted them not from anxiety, but from the specific habit of a structural engineer who measures distances, because distances matter, and because the relationship between where you start and where you arrive is always worth understanding precisely." And in those 41 steps, the room did not make a sound. And I want to tell you about that silence, because it was not the polite silence of an audience waiting for a speaker to begin. It was the specific silence of 230 people simultaneously suspending their social performances, because something was happening that none of their prepared scripts had a category for. And Richard Hartwell at table 1 had a crystal wine glass that had been traveling toward his mouth when I stood up from table 24. And that glass had stopped traveling when the room began to understand the direction of my movement, and it was still suspended between the table and his face when I reached the podium and I placed the folder on the lectern. And I looked at the room, and I looked at Richard Hartwell, and I looked at the glass that had not completed its journey. And I said, "Good evening," and the microphone carried my voice to every corner of the main hall with the impartial efficiency of a system that does not distinguish between the voices worth amplifying. And I began. I said the Morrison Foundation was established 11 years ago, and I said the founding contribution was $240,000 allocated to the emergency remediation of this building's roof structure, which my own structural assessment had identified as requiring urgent intervention. And I said the Board of Governors at that time did not have the capital to address the remediation without eliminating the scholarship program. And I said I made a decision that the scholarship program was the more essential of the two institutional assets. And I said I funded the roof. And I said over the 11 years that followed, the Morrison Foundation contributed to West Haven Academy a total of $4,370,000. And I placed the first document from the folder on the lectern. And I said this is the complete itemized record of every contribution organized by year and by allocation. And I said the library that the board named after a governor family in year 7 was built with Morrison Foundation money. And I said the science block that has appeared in 3 architectural publications as evidence of this school's commitment to educational investment was funded entirely by the Morrison Foundation. And I said the scholarship program that has supported 31 students over 11 years was designed and funded by the Morrison Foundation from the day it began. And I paused, and I let the room absorb what I had said, and the room absorbed it in the way that rooms absorb information that is dismantling the architecture of everything. They believed, they understood. I said I would like to speak about something that happened in the main corridor of this institution on a Tuesday morning in October. And I said a student used a phrase to describe my daughter, and another student as they walked past, and I said the phrase was trash duo. And I said it was delivered at a volume the corridor was designed to carry. And I said my daughter's response was to keep walking and to arrange her face in the expression she has maintained for 4 years of being told by this institution in ways both deliberate and casual that she is not the category of student. The institution was built to celebrate. And I looked at Ashley Hartwell and I said, my daughter studied in the boiler room because the building I funded did not have a seat for her in the library. I paid to restore, and I said she sat at a folding table. I carried down the maintenance stairs myself, and she worked in that room with the highest examination score in the 23-year history of this school's scholarship program. And I said you called her trash, and I said you called her trash in a corridor my money maintains, and in a building my money built. And I said, you have spent 4 years at this institution with your fees, subsidized by an endowment that the Morrison Foundation contributes to annually, and I said you paid for your education with the money of the man you pointed at in the corridor and called trash. And the room had the quality of a space in which something has just been said that cannot be unsaid. And Table 1 had the specific stillness of people who have been identified in a public room and who have no prepared response for the identification. I reached into the folder and I removed the second document, and I said I would like to address a matter of institutional finance, and I said West Haven Academy undertook an expansion program 4 years ago, financed through a commercial debt facility of $6.2 million. And I said that facility was acquired 18 months ago by a property and finance holding company called Aegis Holdings. And I said Aegis Holdings is the commercial subsidiary of the Morrison Foundation. And I said this institution's debt is held by the man who has been maintaining its ventilation system. And I placed the document on the lectern, and I said, I am not only your benefactor, and I said I am your lender. And I looked at Richard Hartwell, and I said, Mr. Hartwell, the property on Lakeview Drive, valued at $3.4 million, has been in mortgage arrears for 4 consecutive months. And I said the mortgage on that property was acquired by Aegis Holdings 8 months ago. And I removed the third document from the folder, and I held it so the room could see it. And I said, this is the notice of default prepared by my legal team. And I said, it has not yet been filed. And I said, that is a matter currently within my discretion. And Richard Hartwell looked at the document and looked at me, and the wine glass was still on the table where it had been set down sometime in the previous 4 minutes. And Richard Hartwell did not pick it up. And I returned the document to the folder. And I turned to the headmistress, and I said, Margaret. And I said the Morrison Foundation's continued support for this institution is conditional on 3 changes. And I said the first condition is the immediate restructuring of the Board of Governors. And I said board membership must reflect genuine commitment to this school's educational mission, and not the size of a family's social profile. And I said the Hartwell era on this board is over. And I said the second condition is the expansion of the scholarship program to double its current capacity administered by an independent committee. And I said the third condition is a complete independent review of the student experience at this institution with particular attention to the environment experienced by scholarship students. And I said my legal team will be in contact with the school's representatives on Monday morning. And I said, I believe that is everything I needed to say this evening. And I closed the folder and I looked at the room one final time, and the room looked back and nobody spoke. And I walked from the podium back through the silent hall toward table 24, where Claire was sitting with her hands folded and her face open in a way it had not been open in 4 years. And I sat down beside my daughter, and I said, "Are you all right?" And she said yes, and she said Dad, and I said yes, and she said the boiler room table, and I said yes, and she said 2 chairs, and I said yes. And Claire looked at the room that her father's money had built, and she almost smiled, and I thought that almost smile was worth every morning at 6:42. At 6:42 on the Monday morning after the West Haven annual gala, the maintenance room of West Haven Academy contained a blue jumpsuit on a hook and nothing else. The name tag on the breast pocket said Morrison Facilities, and the jumpsuit was folded with the same precision it had always been folded because the last person to wear it had been precise about everything. And the hook beside it where the locker key usually hung was empty. And the maintenance roster on the wall showed Thomas Morrison scheduled for the 6:45 entrance hall shift, and Gerald who arrived at 6:38 to collect the floor buffer. Looked at the jumpsuit and looked at the empty hook and looked at the roster, and then picked up the buffer and went to do the entrance hall, because the entrance hall needed doing, regardless of what the roster said, and because Gerald understood, without being told, that the jumpsuit on the hook was not waiting to be worn again. It was a document left deliberately in a room that had never learned to read it correctly. The Monday meeting in the administration suite began at 9, and the people in the room were the headmistress and the school's legal representative, and Elliot Sterling and Richard Hartwell, and Richard Hartwell's lawyer and Claire, who sat beside me at the table, not near the door and not at the back, but at the table in the position the situation had assigned her, which was beside her father, who was the primary party and who had prepared the documentation. The meeting existed to implement Richard Hartwell's lawyer, opened with the position that the foundation's conditions exceeded its donor authority, and that the notice of default represented an aggressive action against a community figure of significant standing. And Elliot Sterling placed 4 documents on the table in the sequence we had organized, and he explained without performance and without drama that Aegis Holdings, as the registered debt holder, had specific contractual rights regarding board governance in a default scenario, and that those rights had been activated, and that the personal mortgage matter was governed by standard instrument terms, and that both positions were legally unambiguous. And Richard Hartwell's lawyer made 2 calls from the corridor and came back and said something to Richard Hartwell in a voice designed not to carry. And Richard Hartwell looked at the documents and looked at me, and he said, "Morrison." And I said, "Mr. Hartwell." And he said, "You planned this for a long time." And I said, "I built this for a long time." And I said, "There is a difference?" And Richard Hartwell signed the board resignation document at 9:48, and Elliot Sterling witnessed it. And Richard Hartwell stood and looked at the room, and the room looked back, and he walked to the door, and he opened it, and he left. And the car waiting outside the administration entrance was not the black car. It was a taxi. And Richard Hartwell got into the taxi, and the taxi pulled out of the West Haven gates, and I watched it go, and I turned back to the meeting, and I said, "Shall we discuss the Sarah Morrison Center?" Ashley Hartwell came back to West Haven after half-term, and the social architecture that had made her the unavoidable center of every room she entered had undergone a restructuring as complete as the one that had removed her father from the board. The people who had occupied her table and attended her events had developed in the intervening 2 weeks. A series of prior commitments and alternative arrangements that meant the table was less full and the laughter was less reliable. And Ashley moved through the corridors of West Haven with the experience of someone discovering that the credit they believed they had accumulated was running on an account that belonged to the circumstances and not to them. And on the Tuesday morning after half-term, Ashley came around the corner of the main corridor, and Claire was walking the other direction. And they were briefly in the same section of corridor the way they had been on the Tuesday in October, when Ashley had said, "Trash duo at the volume the corridor was built to carry." And Ashley looked at Claire, and Claire looked at Ashley. And Claire did not say anything and did not need to, and walked on. And that was the last significant interaction between them. We went to the boiler room on a Wednesday afternoon. Claire and I carried the folding table up the maintenance stairs together and went back for the 2 chairs and put them in the back of my car. And I stood in the boiler room after the table was gone, and I looked at the marks on the floor where the table legs had sat for 4 years. And I thought about Claire's considerable mind working in this room, with the focused attention of someone who has decided that the room's assessment of her is not information she is required to incorporate. And I thought about Sarah, and I closed the boiler room door for the last time, and the Sarah Morrison Center broke ground. The following spring, a 4-story building housing the expanded scholarship program and a common room with no table. Logic, and a library reading room with a seat for every student regardless of family contribution, and a ground floor study space where the door did not have a boiler behind it, and the building was designed by the architectural firm that Claire recommended after reviewing 3 proposals, and I accepted her recommendation without revision. 5 years after the gala. Claire Morrison stood in front of a bridge. She had designed it crossed a river in the eastern part of the city, and it was the kind of structure that people slowed down to look at because it understood what it was trying to say. And Claire stood on the embankment in the early morning before the city had committed fully to the day, and she looked at it with the expression I had seen move freely through her face since the night of the gala. And I stood beside her, and we looked at it together, and she said, "Dad?" And I said, "Yes." And she said, "It is still standing." And I said, "It will keep standing." And she said, "How do you know?" And I said, "Because I know how it was built." I want to say one final thing. I spent 11 years in a blue jumpsuit in rooms that decided what I was before I arrived. And I want to tell you what those rooms never understood. Silence is not the absence of power. Silence is where power is built when the room is not watching. I built in the early mornings and the empty corridors and the invisible hours and the ventilation ducts and the boiler room and the cheap diner on the east side of the city. And I built with the precision of someone who knows that the most significant structures take the longest to complete, and that completion does not require an audience. Never mistake a man's silence for his lack of foundation. The foundation was always there. They were simply standing on it without knowing whose hands had poured it,